Hey, A/B testing is a sub-approach of experimental design which tests two variants against each other in order to determine their effectiveness. A good example of this is the placebo effect, which tests new drugs against the status quo in order to determine how well they work. Today, we're going to discuss why this technique is profoundly weak and understand what are some of the alternative techniques we can use in order to test our supply chains more effectively. So Johannes, perhaps you should just start off as always by just telling us a bit more about what is A/B testing.
So A/B testing is just a method to basically test whether an assumption, an hypothesis is true or not. Typically by doing two groups, but you can do more than two groups. It's a bit fuzzy when it was invented. I mean, I would probably guess that it was invented somewhere in the late 19th century, but the records are fuzzy, and probably because it's something so intuitive, probably people thought about it much earlier, but it was not very clearly documented and not necessarily called A/B testing. But the interesting thing is that it's something that is literally part of the scientific method. It's part of, I would say, the broad field of design of experiments, which is like a scientific way to acquire nuggets of truth about any statement that you can make. So you're not going to be sure. It's not going to prove that any statement is true, but that can give you a scientific answer to the question of, is my hypothesis is true or not?
Okay, so what sort of types of experiments are we really talking about here?
So frequently, I mean, A/B testing is not, I would say, is super popular in marketing. In supply chain, it's much less popular, but we'll get to that. But in marketing, it's heavily used. Things like super basic things, such as, for example, if you're saying like a promotional newsletter, should you advertise this product first or another product first? Well, you can literally split your customer database in two random groups, send version A to the first group, send of your newsletter, send version B to the second half of your customer base, and measure at the end the outcome. And that's a fairly efficient way. That's basically just the core idea of A/B testing.
Okay, so basically the idea is that you're sending out two things and you're seeing which one of the two performs better. So the idea of A/B testing is basically seeing what things out of two performs
exactly.
best.
I mean, you're testing an hypothesis. So, for example, also Google very famously in the early 2000s did an A/B test, actually a series of A/B tests, just to determine how many search results were optimal in terms of display. Obviously, they can return you 100 search results, but it takes longer to load. So people are maybe less satisfied with that. And then you can just send 5 results. It's much faster, but then people have to click next, and they are less satisfied with being forced in clicking next. So there is a balance, and they did, through A/B testing, determine that it was somewhere at the time around 10. I don't exactly know where it stands nowadays.
That's true. It's something that hasn't really changed that much in my memory anyway. So why is this something that's of interest to us here at Lokad? I mean, is it something our customers are really asking for? Why is it of interest?
Yes, actually in supply chain, so in marketing, it's really ubiquitous. People do A/B tests all the time, but actually in supply chain, we are frequently asked either explicitly or sometimes implicitly about doing an A/B test. So in supply chain, A/B testing takes another form. For example, people would say, well, let's have Lokad. We take 10 stores. We keep those stores that are managed through the old inventory optimization system. We take 10 other comparable stores. We let the inventory being driven by Lokad, and we are going to run that for 3 months, and we are going to compare. And that's that they can call it a benchmark, but other than that, it's actually an A/B test. So basically, whenever people say, "Oh, we are going to do like a small pilot with a benchmark," it's a sort of A/B testing, an A/B test going on.
And it sounds fairly rational. Sounds like you do need a way of comparing these two different approaches. So how does it actually work in the real world?
So that's the crux of the problem, is that it looks very obvious, it's reasonable, and you would say, well, it seems, a reasonable way to compare those two methods. I just change one variable. I don't want to change, too many variables. So I just change, for example, the software driving the stock. Good, and then I just want to make sure that my experiment, is representative. So I want to take multiple stores, so it's not just one store, and I don't want to take 3 days. I want to take 3 months. So it's kind of significant in terms of statistical significance, because you have numbers that are large enough. So all of that looks fairly reasonable and rational. But, and there is a bit but, is that it's more complicated than it seems. And there is the problems that I have with those benchmarks is, in my book, it's a bit, I would say, examples of naive rationalism. So it looks like the thing that looks very scientific, but actually it's not necessarily super scientific and not necessarily super rational. It just looks like being super rational. So what the problem? Well, the problem is, in supply chain, is that you tend to displace problems rather than solve them. So, for example, you have those 10 stores. It looks like super rational. The problem is that all those stores, those 20 stores, let's say, they compete with the same stock at the distribution center. Meaning that if I want, to cheat, what can I do? Being Lokad, the software, my own solution, that is, I want to boost my own results. Well, I'm just going to eat up a lot of stock to basically improve the performance of my own scope at the expense of the other scope. And then people would say, oh, but you're not going to do that, right? Well, I say, try me. It's obviously, if you have a benchmark and say, well, the goal is to maximize the performance on those 10 stores, well, obviously, the mathematical optimization is just going to do it. If I just do it directly, no malice, no intent of malevolence. Just if I just say my mathematical optimization is driven to just optimize those 10 stores, it's going to be done at the expense of the other stores. So there is not. It's just very mechanical. So here we have a situation where it looks like you have two situations that are independent, but actually you have like feedback in between the stores just because they are competing through the same for the same stock at the distribution center. And this is something that always happens in supply chain. Supply chains, it's systems, so it's kind of all interconnected, kind of by design. That's why you have those supply chains, that by interconnecting pretty much everything, you have massive, gain in terms of efficiency, reliability, cost, economies of scales, and whatever. But the downside of that is that suddenly, because it's one system, if you touch one part, you tend to influence the other part.
What would be a better approach then? Should you be trying the 20 locations with one technique for 6 months and then another technique for the next 6 months? Or
another problem that I have with this sort of benchmark is that ultimately you learn very little about about your system. The main problem that is typically underappreciated with A/B testing is that you are testing only one hypothesis at a time, and in terms of information, we are talking of having a bit of information, a 0 or 1, just a bit, not even a byte, but a bit. And actually, it's not even a full bit, because you are only going to have this degree of confidence on your results. So actually, it's actually what you learn is like a fraction of a bit, which sounds like very little, and actually it is very little. So my main another criticism that you could have about A/B testing is that A/B testing is good if you want to have like absolute certainty on something where you're feeling very strongly about it. You see, for example, you can literally, if you're very, very strongly convinced that something is superior to another, then to be definitively convinced, then you can do this A/B test to have like the final confirmation that you were right. But the problem is that you're assuming that you already know the truth. That's why it works very well for science, because in scientific methods, people are going to gather clues in very indirect ways. And then once they have gathered, a mountain of clues, then they are saying, okay, we are going to do this A/B test and then confirm that in a more direct way, but it's going to be very, very expensive and slow. And but that will be the final confirmation, putting the nail in the coffin and closing the case forever. But the problem is that with supply chains, things are changing all the time. Your network is an ever-changing beast. So if you can't afford doing, like, maybe, for example, for this A/B test, you would actually not do 3 months, but 12 months. Why 12 months? Because you have seasonality going on, and if you want to be, remove all the problems that are inferred by the fact that one system might be better at capturing seasonality than another, and that maybe the time of the years where you've done your benchmark is not the right one, you need to do it for 12 months. But then it begs the answer of who can afford 12 months to just get one bit of information about is those two systems, which one of those two systems is the best. Because the thing is that you have like a bazillion other alternatives in the market, and you have only so many stores, and your teams, maybe, the problem is that the system A can be actually better for slow movers. The system B might be better for high movers and whatnot. And so having just a bit of information is very weak. It will not give you any insight on which mix can be, the best option.
Okay, so the problem with A/B testing is it's really you're testing two possible paths, and you're basically only getting one idea of which route to take. So in a supply chain, we've got millions of possible paths. So how can we possibly generate information on all of those possible scenarios?
That's something that is actually very, very interesting, and a much more modern perspective on the case. I mean, you see, when you want to think about how do you learn in general, and here we are getting back to literally the machine learning field, and exactly how to extract information from the data, and if you have an influence on the data itself, the way it generates, how can you extract more? Because actually, extracting information about the data, you can think of it as something passive, like data comes and I want to learn, or as something active, where what you do has an influence on what you observe. Which is the case in supply chain. You take a stock decision. If you decide to not put a product on sale in a store, then obviously you're never going to observe the demand, so you will never learn about the demand for this product in this store. So the thing is, A/B testing is a way to acquire knowledge, but when you think about it, it's incredibly sluggish. And if you had to learn as a baby, to walk through A/B tests, it would take a million a year to actually learn walking. It's just something that is, again, it's very, very powerful to have like scientific certainty on certain things, but ultimately that cannot be the process, the journey. It cannot be the things that drives the journey that gets you to the truth. And if we go back to supply chain, well, the thing is, a more modern perspective is the perspective of reinforcement learning, where you think about a trade-off between exploration and exploitation. So the idea is that you have kind of a guess of what is the good things, but you're not completely convinced that it's always, the best. So what you want is to do what is called as exploration. You randomize a bit, your action. So think of it, you have your optimization process that is trying to optimize, according to specified metrics, some algorithm that drive you toward what you think is the optimal according to your measurements. But the problem is that if you do that, you can be stuck in a way of doing things, which is, mathematically, it's what people call a local minima. You try to minimize, cost function, and you're stuck in an area of, like, a local minima, where it looks good. If you deviate from this point, it seems that you have the optimum, but actually if you want to have something that is way better, you need to diverge.
So basically we're talking about introducing a certain percentage of your decision which actually might not be correct and might not actually go with your optimization, but it's basically introducing this certain percentage of potential error just in order to find out more about what could possibly happen. Is that the
exactly.
idea?
And obviously, this is supply chain. You don't want to do crazy things. But for example, if you have a large retail network, the idea would be, well, your assortment, you can decide that all the time in every single store, you're going to introduce a few products that are not usually part of the assortment. Pretty much at random. Obviously, you will not try to do that with super expensive, let's say like an expensive, machine for gardening. If you have a store that is in the middle of a city, so you don't do things that are like completely absurd. But you introduce some randomness, maybe to try if some products would not completely by fluke get a lot of traction just because you've tried them in a city center and usually you were thinking that this product was not good fit for this area, but it turned out that maybe it is. So you want to introduce some kind of randomization. It can be, I've seen people doing that in supply chain, for example, just sometimes try other suppliers just to test the water in terms of lead times. You have your routine supplier and you just pass a few orders to competitors just to see how it goes. And I've even seen companies, in the automotive aftermarket, for example, have that in place, I would say, automatically, where a certain fraction of the orders passed to suppliers are not necessarily passed to the suppliers that offers the best price, the best condition, but they are just passed, to test the water and see if the supplier is super reliable, and if the products meet, if the order there is reliability in the ordering process. It means that when you order a certain part, it's really this part that you get and not another one extra.
It seems very surprising because companies on a whole are normally so based around profitability and acting as efficiently as possible and maximizing that bottom line, that actually introducing this kind of different suppliers just in order to test things, is that a difficult thing to kind of incorporate?
Actually, that's, again, I would say the naive rational approach would say, oh, we just directly optimize. But that's naive rationalism. If you start thinking about the second order effects, the idea is that you want to always be learning about your market. You want to test alternative suppliers. You want to test alternative markets for your clients. You want to test, alternative price point. Because the idea is that there is this knowledge as a price, and it's you can have big rewards. You might be stuck. For example, you might realize that you're selling your product at a certain price point, but actually you could raise your price and it would still more or less sell the same. It's just that you've never tried. You didn't think that people were perceiving your product as valuable as they are. The reality is that usually, you're stuck in what you've been doing so far. Or maybe sometimes the opposite is true. Actually, you're selling your product at a price that is too high. And if you were trying to lower the price, you would actually vastly increase the demand, and then you would have economies of scale that would kicks in, and then you could actually produce at a cheaper price, and have the whole thing that snowballs in terms of reaching of achieving a lot of growth for the company. But so the idea is that this randomization that can be introduced is actually an investment that you make in the idea that you're going to discover, slight variations that are actually better suited for your company. And it can be variations in the way, in your price points, in your suppliers, in your even in your supply chain organization, such as where this warehouse is supplying which plants or vice versa.
Is there any way of kind of quantifying this knowledge and working out actually how much this knowledge is worth to a company?
Actually, yes. I mean, I've even published a paper over a decade ago called, there was an algorithm called POCKER, Price of Knowledge and Estimated Reward. So if you really want to do it the fancy way, you can literally quantify, the cost of exploration versus the reward of exploration of what you gain within a certain, horizon. Because obviously you have to keep playing. It's the idea of having an iterated game where you play the same game over and over and over. And when you explore, well, you do things that are typically less optimal, but sometimes you hit a sweet spot, and then afterward you can exploit these nuggets of finding. But the idea is that in order to do that, you need to have algorithm, especially I would say on the machine learning kind, that can really take advantage of this noise in your data, that can leverage that to learn not just a bit of information but a lot more. And again, this is not just like an A/B test where you're just basically establishing a percentage or something. It's something that is able to capture, I would say, much more fuzzy patterns where you have tons of effects that are kind of interconnected, and that can drive a better performance in a very, I would say, in a very fuzzy, high-dimensional situation.
I mean, how does this approach kind of fit in with what we do here at Lokad? Because what we're doing here at Lokad is we're kind of optimizing those business decisions that can be made at any one time, and kind of introducing this kind of noise, doing things that are intentionally a bit wrong.
Yeah.
That kind of fundamentally goes against that belief, no?
I mean, not my belief, again, about when you want to really factor in the second order effects. So again, it's at Lokad, we really try to apply not to be, I would say, fall prey to naive rationalism, but really to try to be rational, taking into account those second order effects, which are, I would say, wicked. So the bottom line was, during the first decade of Lokad, I mean, for the vast majority of our clients, they were not even optimizing anything. They were optimizing percentages of error, which in my book is not even an optimization, because if you optimize percentages of error, you don't even know what you're doing for your company. So you need to optimize dollars. So the first step is to move toward an optimization process where you actually try to optimize, as opposed to just repeat targets that are completely arbitrary. And now what we see is that with our most advanced clients, especially on the e-commerce side, is that now that this optimization process is in place, now start to emerge, the idea that there is an interest in doing exploration. It typically starts with things like pricing, which, again, from my perspective, is very much into the supply chain scope, because if you that's where the demand comes from. You need to have a good price, and the price explains the demand for a large part. But the price is certainly not the only area where you want to do exploration. And what I'm seeing for the next couple of years is that I think I would say, for companies to remain state-of-the-art, I mean, those who have the ambition to be state-of-the-art in as far as their supply chain goes, they will increasingly introduce those idea of a bit of exploration, of randomization, just to have something that generate the data so that they can drive the optimization process itself and make it better over time.
Okay, so to sort of conclude, you can sort of see in the future there'll be a time when we're actually placing a much higher importance on this kind of exploration and this importance of kind of quantifying how much that gives you as a company in terms of knowledge.
Exactly.
Perfect. All right, we're going to have to wrap it up there for today, but thanks for your time. Okay, that's everything for today. Thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching.